Welcome to the Divine Council Worldview Podcast. This is episode number 1. We're going to be trying to do this every week, coming to you as a team, me and Mike Chu. I'm so glad to have him along, and we'll talk about during this podcast, how we met, why we're doing this, and we'd like to end by talking about what a Divine Council Worldview even is. There's a lot of ideas about it. We are both indebted to our great friend Mike Heiser, and he has passed away. And we aren't doing this about Mike, but we're certainly doing it because of Mike and what he started. So you'll hear his name mentioned here and there, if not all the time. But of course, we have a desire to move the discussion of a Divine Council worldview forward from here. And so I'm so glad to have Mike Chu along with us on this podcast. We are neither of us are professional podcasters. We're theologians, I would say, at heart, and I know I am, and I know Mike is. So you're hearing two guys talk back and forth about the Divine Council worldview because it's coming from our heart. I mean, this is something we've been thinking about for a long time, and of course we love the Bible and want to talk about it. So that's where we're coming from. But let's take this first podcast and just give some background. In fact, I'll start, and then Mike, I'm glad to have you tell your story. I was born in a Baptist pastor's home in Wisconsin, almost a fundamentalist home, I would call it. I wanted to teach the Bible from early on, from junior high, and so I went off to Bible college. That's where I met Mike in my sophomore year it was. He was a freshman, I was a sophomore. 1981, we became good friends, and theological discussions were part of our life all the time. We played on the baseball team together, and took long road trips, and of course, all during those road trips, we talked about the Bible for just because we had fun doing it. But that's where I met Mike. I went off to seminary. He went off to seminary. In fact, we both went to Dallas Seminary at the same time, around 1988. Yeah, 1988. We both went there. His desire was more for ancient history, so he moved over to University of Pennsylvania. I finished at Dallas. We met up again when we were teaching. Our first Bible college teaching experience was at the same school that we both met at, Pillsbury Baptist Bible College. That was in 1991. In 1992, we were on the same Bible faculty for 2 years. I went off to teach at another school. Mike went off to get his degree at Madison at that point. And so this is just going back, kind of rehearsing the story of how we both met, befriended, and became part of this discussion over the years. When it comes to the Divine Council worldview, and I've told this story, Mike has his aha moment sitting in church, and a guy shows him Psalm 82. For me, it was after Mike got going on that, he came up to Minneapolis, and we had coffee, breakfast at a local diner. Our wives were doing something, and we went off to have coffee, and he started explaining his dissertation topic to me on a napkin, a piece of paper. And I just remember kind of shaking my head thinking, if I were to believe what you're telling me, everything would change. And that's where that comment came out that I'll never forget. I said, are you telling me that if I asked Moses whether the other gods really exist, he would say yes? And Mike's classic answer, he said, no, he would be surprised at the question. That the idea that the gods aren't real would have been a shock to Moses. So from there, I changed my dissertation topic to the gods of the Old Testament and how they work into the principalities and powers of Paul. And so he did his dissertation around the same time I did mine. I was pastoring by that point. He was at Logos by that point. So our lives often paralleled at this juncture. And so we talked. He was my closest conversation partner, I would say, throughout most of my life until, again, his passing. So that's my background, and I hope it's enough to get us going. Mike, go ahead and tell us about where you're coming from.
So I guess the pathway that I came to Christ, or just coming to knowing who Jesus was actually, you would think that I could technically say I grew up in a Christian home, but in reality, it was more of Christianity was part of my mother's life, for example, but it wasn't a very integral part. She grew up in a Christian home. She went to church. But eventually, when she and my dad got married, they were originally out in Hong Kong, and then they moved to the States, specifically to Boston. And they gave birth to my sister. So she was the first of us here. And eventually, many years later, I came out. And, part of that interesting story is that it's funny enough, when my parents were thinking about having a second child, one of the things that my mom did, because she has some of that church background, was she started praying to God to specifically give her a son. They were hoping to have a son. And so if that were to occur, one of the things that she had promised in that prayer was that she would support or she would dedicate this son to whatever God would lead him to do. Wow. And ironically enough, her name is Hannah.
I was going to say, that sounds like a Hannah story to me. Yeah.
Yeah. And so originally, and I only found this out years later when I was like a teen, that my name was originally supposed to be Samuel. She was thinking that after I was born, that she would call me Samuel, sort of the whole entire Hannah-Samuel connection. Yet it was my oldest sister, Ruth, who, hearing the name Samuel, she immediately just blurted out loud, "That doesn't sound good. Samuel Chu or Sam Chu." And so she recommended Michael or Mike.
Doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and so it was a funny moment that in many ways it was my sister who named me and not my parents. But that was kind of like that little bit of the background, was that there was always something going on that was even well beyond my own control and my own reach. I didn't become a Christian until I was about 15, and I think a lot of that was because I was trying to be too clever. I had heard about Jesus, I had heard about the idea of salvation, but that didn't really click with me because I purposely and I personally had wanted just to live my life the way I wanted. And so in some sense, the gospel was cool, but I was treating it as, well, that's the last case scenario. When I'm on my deathbed, then I'll finally accept Christ after I lived my life the way I wanted to. God had different plans. He showed me that, one, my life is not in my hands, and two, I have absolutely no control of when or how long I might live. And so that placed me on a journey that eventually I came to know who Jesus was. Now, how I came to actually getting to know Dr. Heiser was actually through a very ironic way. For a long time, especially after I became a Christian at 15, I always had kind of wondered if I was ever going to go into ministry, if I was ever going to go into some sort of theological training. And I always had a little bit of doubt. And part of that doubt was simply because I just wasn't sure. Like, could I actually even do this type of research? Could I actually do this kind of work? And I think partly also from my mother's background, it was, you have to be absolutely sure. You have to have a real intense sense of calling, a feeling. And I had some of that, but then I wasn't sure. It was that just me making it up. And so eventually, years later, I'm married. My wife and I are at a Christian conference, and Logos Bible Software is one of the folks at these tables. And they're doing a special sale, 50% off. And I always heard about the software. And when I was reading the materials, it sounded really good. And I will only find out about this later, but my wife said initially when I brought up the idea, can I go and purchase this? She wanted to immediately say no. But she stopped herself because a thought ran through her mind, which was, this might finally push him over into actually going to seminary. And so she let me buy it. You were in
software before this?
I was in software. I originally trained as a computer engineer, and eventually I got into software quality assurance and then into IT technical training work. And so this was just kind of where I was. And we had always been involved with church leadership. Even the church that I'm currently at, we helped plant about 12 years ago. And so that was always just kind of in the background, but I just never thought I would ever be at a place where I would be at a pulpit or in front of folks teaching. And she just had that thought. And so as I was going through that software, inside the program, they had a little window with a trailer. And so when I clicked on it, it was a trailer for this book called Unseen Realm with Dr. Heiser. And that was how I first heard of Mike's material about the unseen realm. And it intrigued me enough that I ordered the book. And when I started reading it, it blew my mind. One, it made a lot of the stories that I had wondered about, it started making sense. Mm-hmm. And two, I grew up in a Chinese heritage church as a Christian. And one of the emphases within my church was the importance of the good news, of evangelizing, of sharing the gospel to people. And especially the part where Mike talked about the mountain, where he is asking the disciples, who do people say I am? And then he starts talking about the church, and he starts talking about this rock that the church will be built on. It finally started clicking, because I had always heard it as being, a Protestant argument, a Roman Catholic argument. But what Mike went down towards was essentially using geography and using the culture and history of that place to really just break open this idea that it isn't a denominational thing.
Right.
It's actually a part of the mission of the church and what is part of what we are meant to be and what we're meant to do. And so that was how, I got into Mike's material. And then years later, he came down to Boston for a podcast episode that he was doing. And I got to meet him there. And eventually, a year or more later, he and I connected via online, started chatting. And so I started helping him out with some of his side projects, helping him out with his social media kind of presence. And that was how I got introduced to Dr. Heiser and just got to know him as a mentor and as a friend.
Yep. And I got to know you through, I guess, the Awakening School would be where we officially contacted, doing some teaching for them, but also just through the Facebook page and seeing your name there. And so then we just became friends that way. So when I was thinking about, and I forget how we even came to the idea of doing a podcast, or I came to it, but when I thought of a co-host, your name first came to mind, and I thought, well, there's no way you'd have the time to do it, and that would be a big score if I could do that. So I didn't even try. And then somehow I was given the green light to ask you, and for you to say yes was a big thing. So I really do appreciate it. And the way you described your background, I think we should throw this out here right away. I'm non-confessional. In fact, I'd like to ask you how you take that idea. If I were to say to you, I'm non-creedal, I'm non-confessional, I'm Baptist by background, E-free by licensure, CMA by just because I was in the CMA church for a while. I've taught for 20 some years undergraduate at non-denominational schools. Okay. If I were to say I'm coming at the Divine Council Worldview as a non-confessional Christian, how does that sound to you?
I think it all depends on what we mean by the term confessional or non-confessional, right? So the way that I had gotten used to using the word confessional was simply, you're actually a follower of Jesus. Versus like confessional being like, I confess, or I recite, or I have an allegiance in some sense to a creed. I would say, it sounds fine to me. As long as we're defining the terms.
It's probably good to get that out before we keep going. But the beauty of the Divine Council Worldview, from what the people that I've met through Mike and such, we don't, and Mike is famous for saying this, that we trust the text. You trust the text. And it's not that creeds and confessions aren't helpful, but we're not going to read the Bible through a creed and because of a denominational lens and that sort of thing. And so I would agree. In theory, I believe the Bible can be interpreted. The story of the Bible, especially, can be interpreted without the lens of a creed. The danger of that, of course, is getting off on your own little tangents. And I found this in teaching, that when people don't disagree with you from the audience, you tend to think you're right. And so the challenge of a podcast even is thinking that you're right because no one's talking back at you, right? So the beauty of this, I hope, will be that we can play off each other well, and our similar backgrounds and also our differences in backgrounds will be evident for the audience to hear, so. Well, good. Thank you. And as we keep going here, just on some introductory ideas, I'm always happy to hear, where the Lord has led you and where He's taking you. You're at Gordon, or you finished at Gordon your MDiv, and you're in doctoral work?
I did. So I finished my Master's of Divinity this past May, and honestly, it was kind of like a either or, and I decided just to give it a try to go into the Doctor of Ministry program at Gordon as well. Obviously, I loved my school, and so it just was just like I tossed my hat in the ring just to see if it actually would work, and they accepted me. And so I literally walked down the graduation aisle in May, and then 3 weeks later, I was starting my program for Doctor of Ministry. Cool. And so, I mean, I had friends and some, even my wife were wondering, like, don't you want to take a break? Like, well, I want to, but at the same time, the program started right in June. So
when do you
if I wanted
finish,
to get in,
then what's the projected finish date?
The projected finish is in about 2.5 years. I'll be done with the Doctor of Ministry work. When I would actually present my dissertation and hopefully be given my actual degree would be probably 2 more years from then. So I'm looking at a total of 5 years.
Sounds good. So for the record, I work for a bank. I spend 8 hours a day online with doing technical writing for a bank. I outside of those hours, I'm thinking theology all the time, like I've always done. But you're busy with D-Min work then throughout the week, and you're busy at your church. So makes sense. Just again, some background to why we're doing this, and to get us into this question of what is a Divine Council Worldview, which I'd like to conclude with for this first podcast. There are many Divine Council Worldview adherents who are listening here who are either coming into it new, or they've been around it for a long time. So I want to be able to appeal to both sides of that. Those who want to understand the Divine Council Worldview better than they already do, and those who simply want to know what it even is. I think there's many people who have sat on the sideline looking at that term or hearing about it but not knowing what to do about it. And so I certainly want to welcome people into the worldview as we talk, and try to define the worldview in such a way that it's like a clearinghouse for ideas that have been surrounding the worldview for many years. Because again, there are many decision points along the way. I mean, we'll do this when we get into podcast 2 and on. I'd like to go right into Genesis. Mike never got to Genesis in his podcasts. And so this would be a great place for us to jump in and just verse by verse work our way through the text, thinking in terms of, and there's a lot of ways to study the Bible, right? But this podcast will be how to interpret the Bible through a Divine Council worldview. So we'll be selective in the verses that we study and talk about. We're not going to skip any, of course. We don't want to do that, because a worldview always takes into account everything that you come across. But at the same time, where we hover and where we dig in will certainly be those issues that a Divine Council worldview touches on. But as I said, there's a lot of decision points along the way, a lot of paths that you have to make a decision. Am I going to do this or that? Am I going to go this path? Or maybe there's 4 or 5 different ways to look at a text, and then talk about, well, if I took that path, where would it take me? Where would it end up? If I took another path, so forth, where would that end up? So that'll be a lot of our discussion. And when I say clearinghouse, I mean, I think there's some people who, because of specific, in fact, I just read a review from Desiring God Ministries about one of Mike's books, or was it Unseen Realm? It might have been. It just came out in 2022. Mm-hmm. A review from Desiring God, and I just read it yesterday, so I'm not ready to do an expose on a review, but nor is it my intention. But I appreciated the writer's point. At the same time, I thought to myself, he's getting hung up on a phrase, a word, an idea that Mike had that may not be a requirement of the Divine Council worldview. So at the end of the article, he tended to, in my estimation, downplay the strength of the worldview based on some of the shall I call them idiosyncrasies that Mike brought into it, right? And Mike has every right to do that. Mike is Mike, and Mike has every right to have views. So do we. And what I want to be able to do through this podcast is say, you can have a Divine Council worldview and yet differ on certain issues within that list of things that we can differ about. So any thoughts there, Mike, when it comes to how to define a worldview? I'd like to spend the remaining time going through what I've come up with as six items that I would call personally a definition of the Divine Council worldview in 6 points. So we'll get to that in a moment. But any other thoughts you had, Mike?
Well, I think the importance of us doing this podcast, it like you said about a clearinghouse, right? It's one of the things that I had loved about when I studied the Reformation was this interesting period when folks like Martin Luther and John Calvin and Zwingli and many others were actually discovering the text for the first time in a much richer way, right? They finally were being exposed for the first time to a lot of the Greek manuscripts that underlaid their Latin translations. And when they started seeing the really stark differences at certain points, that was when they started exploring and started getting more into the actual text. And so I think that's kind of one of the things that I hope to see is that with a DCW perspective, that this spirit of the Reformation, this idea of always returning back to the text would be our primary, value. I think, when we were talking a little bit about creeds and confessionals, like I agree for the most part that the creeds are really great summaries of vast amount of like scripture knowledge. It's a very interesting thing to realize that the folks who crafted these creeds, they for the most part were reciting the scriptures they were bringing up by memory.
Right.
That they knew huge swaths of it. And so for them, the creeds were really just shortened versions of what was already in their heads.
Right.
But for us these days, everything is essentially on our smartphone. And it is a very interesting kind of concept to realize that maybe we have to make sure that we go back to the text instead of just depending on, in some sense, the Cliff Note version that is often found in a creed.
Right.
And so that's kind of one of the things that's on my heart about it.
Thank you. Yeah. And I like how N.T. Wright puts it. I'm going to paraphrase him. He's one of my favorite authors today. He is certainly not dependent upon creeds, but he appreciates them. And he often says, Luther, Calvin, a generation later and such, they were answering the right questions, or they answered the questions they were thinking about, in his opinion, in the right way, but they may not have been asking the right questions. And I think for me, the Divine Council worldview as an idea is going back and asking a different question from the text, or sometimes different questions, plural, and from that different question, coming up with a whole set of different answers, right? And so it may be questions that were never thought of even by Luther. And so I'm not by any means picking on our forebears for what they didn't see in the text, because our, generations after us, people will be looking at us the same way, and they'll say, why didn't they see this or that? And so we all have to approach the text humbly. At the same time, I think what Mike introduced to the world, really, and we often said this to each other, whether we're driving somewhere or just in emails, we're not saying anything new, are we? We're just taking all these ideas that we're learning and going back to the text and seeing how they work. And I remember when I was doing my dissertation, audible, or what do they call it, the oral defense, where you write your dissertation, it's approved officially, but then you sit in front of your department, basically, of your school. For me, it was at Dallas Seminary, and you are quizzed orally over your dissertation. And a standard question that every disserter is asked is how, or what did you add to the body of knowledge? What did you add to the academic world, right? Because you always have to add something. And I had a prepared answer. I said nothing. I simply took what liberal scholarship was saying and applied it to an evangelical worldview. Well, and I didn't mean by that to get in trouble, because I saw the eyes of the department heads look at me with interest, like, what do you mean nothing? And when I explained what I did, oh, okay, well, that made sense, because evangelicals don't read, in general, liberal scholarship. So what Mike did, again, and this is where we often talked, all he was doing was taking liberal or academic work that was being accepted by peer-reviewed journals, that was well-done stuff, and saying to the evangelical world, guys, we got to read this stuff. This is good stuff. And so that's again what I would say about creeds. I don't want to criticize them openly as much as say we have every right, I think we have the duty as modern Christians to think back into the text itself and say, did they ask the right questions? And then go from there. Well, how about we do this? Let's close up our first podcast here by asking the question, so what is a Divine Council worldview? I think it's a very helpful way to start, so we have some ground to work with. There are, and let me say it this way, these ideas that I'm going to give, and 6 in general, are not particular to a Divine Council worldview, and it's certainly possible that a person who has a Divine Council worldview is not familiar with what I'm about to say. But here is my best shot at giving definition to what I think we mean, and here's where, Mike, I want you to, honestly push back if you want, or as you would like, about how to define what a world council or a Divine Council worldview is. Okay, so I'm going to give you, or I'm going to read 6 carefully crafted sentences, each one giving an idea to, I think, what's necessary to a Divine Council worldview. Number 1, the starting point for all biblical interpretation is an attempt to understand the original writer, his intended audience, and the culture they shared. This means, for example, among many things, that all biblical study must use original languages. Okay, so the first idea, again, this is not particular to the Divine Council worldview, but it's certainly incumbent upon the worldview that at any point during a discussion we say, well, what did the original Greek or Hebrew say? And do textual work first. And from that world of whether it's language, culture, audience, writer, whatever, they're going to get first dibs on the meaning of the text. And thus that's how we can say, shall we say, that we're not bringing a creed directly into our conversation. It may eventuate, in a creed, but it's not going to start there. Does that make sense, Mike?
It does, and I think it's just one of those. It's that little bit of knowledge that folks have to always remember, is that the scriptures were not originally written to us. It wasn't originally written to like an English audience. It was originally written to an audience that spoke a completely different language and also lived in a completely different culture. And so there are unspoken rules and values that we have to sort of decipher and sift out before we just make a conclusion on any text.
In that article that I read, that review of Mike's by a Desiring God gentleman, he did give the sense that it can sound, what word do we want here? It can sound a little proud or almost unfair that God would want us to go back to the original culture, the original language. And so as I've shared that idea, even in my teaching over the years, that the Bible can be read in English, but it must be studied in Greek and Hebrew. Just like I use Karl Marx, I've got to use German, or Machiavelli, I've got to use Italian. If I want to study someone, I have to use the original language that they wrote in. That can come across to an audience as either A, that's unfair because I don't speak Greek and Hebrew, or B, I thought God wrote the Bible for us, right? And how, in other words, it's almost a defeatist feeling that you can give an audience when you say you've got to study the text in its original. Most of us don't read in, Greek and Hebrew. So is it fair to say, and again, I'm curious what you think, Mike, we're not trying to say it's unfair. We're trying to say this is how any study works on any level for any literature. You're simply asking, what did the writer mean? It's not unfair, in other words, and I don't think it means, and I've never taken it this way, to be that God is being, selective in who gets to read his Bible. He's just saying the beauty of the human understanding of what it means to learn and to discover is just built into us. And if we want to discover what the Bible means, let's do what that task expects of us. So I hope it doesn't come across as an exclusivistic idea, that Bible study is only for some. It does mean the world of discovery is out there for us, and we are expected by God to use every opportunity we can to get further and further into knowledge of the Bible. So, number two, I would agree, of the six.
Oh,
you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think just to address that idea, I think one thing that's kind of key, at least for me, I was thinking about this since last week, was sometimes we conflate the idea of Bible reading and Bible study as though they are synonymous, like that they are equal to one another. And I think the reality is, and even Mike has said this before, where Bible reading and Bible study are actually two separate kind of mental tasks, right? Where more often than not, we should be reading. We should be soaking ourselves and getting familiar with the text. But when we're actually doing study, it does require some work. Now, I agree, if you can get into the original languages, please do. But even if you don't have, that training or the ability to get that training, I mean, I remember as a young Christian teen, I discovered the beauty of a parallel Bible, where in one giant book, it would have 2 or, in my case, 4 translations in English of the scriptures, all right next to each other. And so I would actually, when I was doing a study, I would be actually reading the same passage, and I would go to each of these translations, and I would notice, why is it the NIV says it this way, and yet the American Standard Version says it that way? Like, what's going on here? And those moments indicate there's a difference in the text. And
that was my freshman year at Bible college. I had a four column Bible, and being raised on the King James Version, I had the King James on the left column, and then I had NIV and whatever. And I remember looking back to the left column every time I was wondering what the text really said, right? So, because I would see these other versions, and it threw me as an 18-year-old that the Bible could have different versions. But you learn over time that all 4 of them are basically interpretations of the original text. So, yeah. Well, let's move on. Number 2. I'm sure we're going to come back to these ideas as we go. But the second salient idea that comes into a Divine Council worldview is this, and here's how I'd say it. The cosmology of the Bible presumes a society of divine beings who were created by one deity. This single Most High God, as he's sometimes called, is named YHWH. We pronounce it Yahweh. Jehovah actually is a Germanic transliteration from that. So Yahweh, Jehovah, whatever. That's the name that this God claims in the Bible. And he exhibits unquestioned eternal rule over all spirits and humans. There's our monotheism. If we wonder, how does monotheism and the Divine Council worldview work together? Monotheism is a 17th century philosophical term, so it's open to discussion as to how to interpret it. And what, as I understand it, monotheism is a comparable idea. It's saying of all the spirits in the world, there is a world of spirits, and we can think of synonyms like divine beings, deities, sometimes angels, although I'm going to recommend we don't think in that term because it's fraught with medieval overlays. But spirits, divine beings, deities, gods, these are all synonyms for a world that's above us or beyond us or in a spirit realm, shall we call it. And the point is for a monotheistic view to be real for me and a Divine Council worldview to work, and again, I'm throwing this back to you, Mike, to give your impression. We have one deity who creates everything else. And by that act of creation and sustenance, sustaining his creation, he is the unquestioned authority and ruler over all. Okay? Does that make sense?
It makes sense.
I think we can avoid, in other words, polytheism as an attack. And I often hear in the Divine Council worldview reviews that I hear is, well, boy, it sounds like polytheism to me. But of course, polytheism is, a set of gods that vie for not only worship, but power and authority and things like that. And we're not saying that at all. We're saying there's one God. He often gets the capital G in our head and in our Bible. The Bible didn't have capital letters, though. So there is no capital G God in the Bible. There's a Most High God, there's a Yahweh, and there's those kind of things. But that's the beauty of this worldview, is that we get to go into the text and notice how it defines Yahweh in ways that we often don't expect. And for my money, I take all the capital letters off everything in the Bible, knowing they don't have capital letters. So, Yahweh, your God, turns out to be a small g in my head, because they only had that version of a deity in their head. In other words, the word God has got to be defined for them. It's too general. And that's why Yahweh, your Elohim, is often the way he's described in the Old Testament. But we need to move on. Any other thoughts, though, in response to that?
I think what you bringing up about how, the small g and that Yahweh is associated with that, I'm still processing it. I'm still going back and forth on it. But I do understand that in many ways, for the ancient Israelites, they were encouraged to actually view Yahweh as their personal God, as theirs. And so, oftentimes, because we're following a certain kind of rabbinic tradition, often in our English translations, that the divine name is translated as Lord. It does make our translations a little woody,
right,
at times. And there is something very personal when you actually can say, the Yahweh is my God.
Yep.
And so there's an ownership that's happening. And so I think it's a great thing to highlight, and that it isn't saying that we believe in polytheism and that, that there are all these rivals that have equal power to God. It isn't. He is the sole creator. Yahweh is the sole one who actually made all things.
All right, number 3, this is a third of 6 points that would define a Divine Council worldview in my estimation. At an early point within the biblical story, Yahweh delegated authoritative power to a number of created deities over the physical world. That would include nations and things like that. Judgment is yet promised upon a number of these beings for their misuse of this authority. Now, a lot is packed into those 2 sentences. A lot of Mike's books and writings and discussions are about that idea that, now, this is very distinctive to a Divine Council worldview. Not only are the gods real, but Yahweh has delegated to them real power, real authority over the world. And this probably happened, again, there's debate on this issue as to exactly when, but somewhere in early Genesis, we suspect, the Tower of Babel incident is probably the most likely, that God distributed to these beings, and again, how many, which, is there a certain number, that kind of thing I think we can talk about. But the idea of giving these gods a real power, real authority, and expecting the world to live up to that authority, to not push against it, but to actually understand that they are under this authority. To me, this is part of the worldview. And yet, Psalm 82 again is the classic passage that got Mike's attention. These gods are, by the time you get to the middle of the Old Testament story, you are hearing that Yahweh is upset with what they have done, with that authority, with that power. And he has promised judgment upon them. That again can be a conversation, within the worldview. But that's my third point. Any thoughts there?
No, I agree with it, and I think that's one of the interesting things that, like, the way that I have often described this to folks is that they were not meant to be worshipped. That was part of the judgment that was pronounced upon them in Psalm 82. What they really were supposed to be were guardians over various different people groups. And the fact that they start abusing that power, misusing what they were given to be responsible for, I think that is ultimately where the rubber is meeting the road, so to speak. One time, I remember Mike was answering this question of, who are the divine beings who actually stayed obedient, who stayed loyal to Yahweh, from guarding or stewarding the nations. And I mean, he very astutely kind of pointed out that if you have a divine being who is loyal to Yahweh, why would that divine being then, by definition, being loyal, try to get everyone's attention?
Yeah,
that divine being would want to repoint everyone back to the Creator God, to the Most High. And so, I mean, it was a beautiful kind of argument that, if they were doing their jobs correctly, ultimately we would be directing our worship back to the Most High God, to Yahweh himself.
And we'll take this conversation, obviously, as we get through Genesis. It's going to force us into this conversation. But then as you move through the Bible, you get to Acts 17. Here's my personal opinion. And Mike and I talked about this. I don't think we are exactly on the same page here. But again, that's why it's a conversation point, is that in Acts 17, you get the sense that Paul, who certainly believed that God divided the world into the powers of the heavens, right? That's Acts 17:22 or so, that Paul was hoping that, at least in his sermon to these pagans, that by having that power over them, that we would seek, quote, we would seek the Lord. That they were guardians, they were meant to be guardians that would bring the world to loyalty to Yahweh. Now, whether God knew, again, we don't want to presume that God doesn't know what was going to happen, but the story that Paul had in his head was to these Athenian philosophers was that the idea of God's being over your world and ours, or the world in general, was not God's design to run the world downhill. It was actually meant, if you want to say it this way, to bring the world to a loyalty to Yahweh. But of course, that project failed. And so, anyway, thank you. So that's a third. Number 4, again, of specific, there's so many things that we're skipping over, but here's again what I think is incumbent upon the worldview. Number 4, Jesus Christ has presently assumed by the decree of Yahweh the place of highest honor over all gods and humans. Now, we're skipping a lot of information, of course, from the Old Testament into the New. But by the time we hit Philippians 2, for example, we have a story that is compressed by Paul into this great, what I call the V story, coming from heaven to earth and ascending back. Therefore, he is now exalted above all gods and lords. So whatever the Divine Council worldview is, person to person, and again, it can vary, I think we agree on this 4th point, that the story of the Bible is ultimately, by God's design, Yahweh's design, his Son Jesus Christ is now Lord over all gods and lords and humans. Any thoughts there to add?
No, absolutely agree.
Again, when I say that, even when I read it, I think, boy, did I skip a lot of the Bible there. But no, it's just, we have to move on to, we'll get to the other pieces coming up, but that's the 4th. Number 5, the locus of the gospel message. Now, this is me, Mike. I don't know, again, how it strikes the average ear of the listener, but for me personally, and this is where I've spent the last 10 years of my life, I know, well, let me give you a 60-second story here. What's behind number 5? When I was attempting to get licensed by my denomination 10 years ago, what I'm about to read was the sticking point. And the denomination, which I love the people of the denomination. Again, we left as friends, but the denomination said to me, if that's going to be your gospel, while we may respect it, we can't have you preaching that from our pulpit. So when I read this, again, it sounds pretty straightforward, but this will divide the Christian world, I've found, into not just two groups, but maybe more. So number 5, the locus of the gospel message throughout Acts and Paul's epistles was loyalty to Jesus / Yahweh above all other gods. Now that / is important, obviously, because we have to define then what's the relationship between Jesus and Yahweh. But I'd like to leave that for, again, further conversation. But the point is that the gospel that Paul was going out, moving from east to west, he was heading to the west. Why? Because he wanted to express the authority of Jesus over the entire world, undoing Genesis 11 in my mind. That is the gospel message. And when I say it that way, you can see why a church licensure board would say, well, what about repentance? What about original sin? What about forgiveness? What about the righteousness of God dispensed or imputed upon the sinful individual? When I got that question, I said, those are sub-questions for me. That's not the gospel. That's other issues that come with it. So, what do you think?
I mean, I think over the years, as I've gone into like the DCW materials, and really just kind of, also like this is again why getting back to the original languages are important. Like once I actually had to study what the word for what we normally see in the New Testament translated as faith or believe, like that really shifted a way that I had even presented the gospel a lot of times to people, where I realized it really often was a mental assent. Like, make sure you believe this. But there wasn't an actual, who am I ultimately being loyal to? Now, that was there once you start asking more questions, but that wasn't the forefront in my mind.
Yeah, that's
and I think that's kind of what this point that you're bringing up is just really laying that out, that loyalty or allegiance or faithfulness, however way you want to describe it, it's ultimately going to be to Jesus the Christ. And that's the gospel message. It is a herald of a coming king, of a king that already had come and will come back again. And so, like, to me, that there is no problem with that. But I do know that, especially in certain groups, in certain camps and traditions, that message gets kind of lost in the noise with all the other details that in some sense they want to make sure you understand, and they have, good reason to. But there's also, sometimes that muddling can really make it hard to realize that at the core of it all, it's about who are you saying is your king.
Yeah, beautifully said. Oh, you made me think of something, but I forget it as soon as you stop talking, I forgot what I was going to say, but that's fine. That always tells me it's time to move on, right? Oh, I know what it's going to be. I'm preaching Sunday. You're preaching Sunday at your church. In my sermon this Sunday, I'm just being one of several of a teaching team, and we're talking about, what we're talking about is Ecclesiastes, but I'm going to bring it into a Divine Council Worldview, wouldn't you know it? And the point that Hebrews 11 is the faith chapter, and Hebrews 7 through 10 is the priest stuff, right? And it's funny to me how we have made the priest stuff kind of this mechanical way to get saved, when really I think the point is Hebrews 11 tells us how to get saved. There's your faith. There's your loyalty. These people, and it lists these Old Testament characters that were not behaviorally very good, but they, at least consistently, but they had faith, and the text is clearly trying to say this is what God needs. Hebrews 7 to 10, while important, while interesting, especially to a Jewish mind, I'm going to recommend that's all noise. That's the noise that the Jewish mind goes through in order to get into sacred space and to worship God, with the right to approach Him and stuff like that. But yeah, so I'm just saying what I already said, but the issue or the locus of the gospel for me, and I think the Divine Council Worldview can handle this, I really do, that it's about loyalty. It's about Jesus and God and how to, and the Father, and how to think in terms of loyalty to them. The last point as we close up here, again, so much we're skipping over, but to me it's part of this worldview, is in the next age, believers will assume the status of theoi, or how do you say it? Theos in Greek. The I is added to the noun theos, turning it into an adjective. Divinely, we are divineness, I guess, or deityness. We are imparted with a deityness when we die, or as believers when we enter the next age. And then I say a position which will rival, possibly replace, the ruling gods of this present age. Again, so much that we can talk about and even disagree about. But the point is that in the next world, the Divine Council Worldview has this interesting idea that, again, it's part of the Orthodox Christian faith. In other words, others who are not necessarily part of a Divine Council Worldview believe this, but this is part of the Divine Council Worldview, that these gods that we've talked about through the entire storyline of the Bible have a role in the next world. And we're not sure how we'll relate to them. At some point, Paul talks about us ruling over them, 1 Corinthians 6. How that will work, we're not told. But the idea that we become, in some sense, theosness, or divine in some world view, and how that works, again, we're on this side of that question. Mike might know more than we do right now because he's passed over. But the idea of us becoming divine is part of the worldview. So we're always aiming toward that.
And it's kind of interesting that you're bringing this up, because even in the last few days, in the Facebook group that I help manage and all, there have been conversations about this old term that's now being made aware to some folks. This term that the early church used to call theosis.
Yep, divinization. Augustine would
exactly.
call it. Yeah.
And I've actually kind of remarked before in times the Reform or Protestant kind of traditions, we have a term called glorification, which is like a 16th century way of, I think, describing the same idea of ultimately we're getting to a place where we will be made like Jesus the Christ.
Yeah,
that
he's the first fruit.
Our bodies will be
become.
transformed.
Yeah.
The rulership, in some sense, the control that sin would ever have over us, the dominance that it has at times over our lives, that we are freed from that. Yeah. And I think it doesn't go as far as at times when the early church fathers would look at things and say, this is our destiny. We're looking towards an idea that we will actually rule with Jesus. We will be co-heirs with him. And that just blew their minds, and it blows my mind when I started learning about it.
I remember as a kid when the idea of eternity hit me. I was 10 years old, throwing a ball against a wall, and it just struck me that I'm going to live forever. And I remember laying in the grass and staring at the sky as a 10-year-old, thinking, scares me to death. But how it's going to work. I think we all get to say from this side of eternity that we don't understand it. Right? No one's going to argue that, like next week's weather, why argue about it? It's going to happen. Same with this. Whatever God does in our next age, we are happy participants in that world, but to argue about it is kind of foolish in my mind. But we can speculate, we can read the text and be amazed at it. So that's all part of the worldview. I close with this, and I threw a list together as I was putting those 6 items on paper. I wrote this out. The following ideas are often discussed within a Divine Council worldview, though not all adherents agree in specifics. Mike and I, again, we just have so much fun. And that's what I loved about Mike. A good conversation partner theologically is someone who lets you vent, smiles at you and says you're nuts, and then remains your friend, right? And that's what Mike was for me on so many levels. So again, listen to this. We will certainly touch on each of these topics as we come across them, giving reasons for why a Divine Council worldview can handle different interpretations. So, things like the identification of the image of God in man, the predictive element of Genesis 3:15, the falls of spiritual beings in Genesis 3:6 and 11, the original fall of Adam, original sin or guilt, the origin of demons, the role and identification of divine messengers, we call them angels, the identification of the angel of the Lord, the appearance of Yahweh on earth, the meaning of the Garden of Eden, the concept of a council, quote unquote, of the gods in the ancient Near East, definition and role of sons of gods. This is a big one because of the Facebook group that I've been listening to over the years. Calvinism and Reformed theology and how it relates to Divine Council worldview topics. Mike was a big free will guy. That was our first argument as college friends. I was a big Reformed guy. He was, no, I must say big. That was my background, Reformed. He was coming from free will. So we argued tooth and nail and had friends, still had friendship over it. Relationship of Yahweh to Jesus and other Trinitarian issues. Sacred space. Cosmic geography, that's part of that. Atonement, penal substitution, exorcism. I mean, the list could go on, but that's just what that took me maybe 10 minutes to think through all the things that Divine Council people love to talk about, but they don't necessarily agree. And that's why I would love this podcast to be a clearinghouse for not every idea, because I don't know them all, but for people to know, hey, you can have a Divine Council worldview and not agree on what the image of God in man is. That's fine, because it's not incumbent. There'll be, and we've used this metaphor as we've talked, Mike. It's like you're in a forest and you see someone walking beside you through the thickness of the trees, and you don't know where their path is taking them. You know where your path is kind of going, and you're following a path. You see them next to you, but you don't see the path they're on, and you don't know how they got on that path, looking backwards. And you don't know if your two paths will converge. And that's what I find in the Divine Council worldview friendships that I've had, is you hear other views and you wonder, okay, I think I know how you got there. I don't know where it's going. Oh, okay, maybe I do know where it's going. So that's what I want to do during this podcast is give ear, give room, give credence, in fact, to a lot of views that may be part of the Divine Council worldview per individual, but they're alone on something, so. Where to from here? Let's do this next time we meet is our episode number 2. Let's just drop into the text of Genesis 1 and begin a long weekly. This is our intent, is to have a weekly podcast here to work our way through Genesis. And sometimes we'll slow down, work verse by verse. Other times, of course, we'll just move through it text by text, but that'll be the goal. So anything else before we sign off, Mike?
No, I think we have a good plan that's laid out, and if anything, I do want to say thank you, Ron, for inviting me to actually participate in this. Originally this is a project that's part of the Dr. Michael S. Heiser Foundation, and this podcast, when it was originally talked about and the idea was being floated, originally I thought it was you would take on the reins and you would be just doing it in many ways similar to how Mike used to do it with his podcast. And so to actually have the opportunity to join you in this kind of dialogue and conversation, I'm greatly honored. It really is something that I've always enjoyed doing, especially with Mike when, I was helping him out with the Awakening School of Theology and doing live QAs with him. Those moments were precious to me because it gave me a chance to be able to hang out with Mike, even if it was just online, but to have just conversation. And that is a very important thing for me personally, to have dialogue and conversation with people.
Well, thank you. And I had, wondered about doing this and who would be a good co-host, whether it be just a listener, someone who, and I had in mind someone who would be just a curious, she's in seminary, a curious voice that would be learning literally as we go. And then, of course, I thought of you and I thought, well, there's no way he can have the time to do it. But so thank you. This is a better way to go. This is where we both, I would say, know, what we're talking about because of the issue. We've both been just entrenched in it. And at the same time, we don't agree on everything. That's the beauty of this too. I mean, we've already talked enough to know that we're coming at the text from different directions at points. But that's the beauty of this, and that's why I love Mike so much. No one I'd love to, get emails from and talk on the phone and text with than a guy like Mike who would be willing to talk and not necessarily agree. That's good, for the soul. So I think this will be fun, and again, I hope it'll be beneficial for all the listeners. So thanks again, everyone, and we'll talk to you.